sounds really easy standing here today in 2019. It was a very difficult journey to get there. It was even harder to get to an agreement amongst essentially the two lower basin states to take shortages and allow California to not have to take a single drop of shortage in recognition of the congressional legislation that they had been able to pass, and that was embedded in federal law. All of us said, fine, we really don't have much of a choice but to begin to take less and allow that water to stay in Lake Mead. Getting to that point, getting to that realization, getting to the point where we set the stage for DCP was really tough. But there were some fundamental pieces that I think will be foundational in going forward toward 2026. I looked at the lineup of speakers for this conference over the next 2 days. What you're going to hear are a lot of people's and groups' individual visions of how they would retool the Colorado River. We see a lot of, let's fix it. It's gone wrong. How do we get it right? Can I tell you, your crystal ball gets really murky if you go beyond 20, 25 years, because you don't know what the reality of this basin is going to be like. There are not going to be any extreme overturns of the compact, any extreme measures that will forever change the Colorado River in accordance with one particular group or one particular state's vision. It won't happen. We would never have gotten to 2000. We would even less have been likely to get to 2007 had we not accepted the fact that everybody's issues were real. Everybody had their own set of constituency. Everybody had to go home to their own body politic. It had to work for everybody. It couldn't be an environment of winners and losers anymore. Those days were over. There was only one loser that was going to be in that room, and that was going to be all of us. You didn't even have the luxury of time to wander through the United States Supreme Court for 20 years. So as you sit here over the course of the next 2 days, listen carefully to what everyone's pressure points are, because those pressure points are going to be the defining moments that will shape what 2026 will look like. My prediction is 2026 will not be an in perpetuity change. It will be the next step in this cultural journey on the Colorado River. It'll be the next step, limited in time and condition, on how we will address what has clearly become a river ravaged by climate change. Whether you want to accept it or not, I completely leave up to you. You can call this a historic drought, you can call it whatever you want, it's a reality. And I know that for this year, a lot of us are wrapping ourselves in the Linus blanket of comfort because we've had a wonderful snowpack and drought's over, we're done. I would ask you just to look back several years when we had a similar nice wet winter, only to be confronted by the driest winter immediately thereafter. We are in a very volatile period. And so having the maximum amount of flexibility, having the maximum amount of recognition of what it's going to take to be able to get to an agreement, which is going to have to be extremely respectful of everybody's issues. There's no solution that vilifies one group. I've gotten pretty allergic to speeches that say, we have a problem and it's the agricultural community's fault. We have a problem and it's the water waste in Las Vegas or the water waste in LA that is causing the problem. Guess what? It's all of the above, and none of it, in the eyes of the user, is a waste. And every one of us has an opportunity to use less and become a part of tomorrow's reality solution. I am very optimistic. There were voices leading up to 2007 that said, you'll never get there. It is too hard. It is too heavy a lift. And at the end of the day, we got there. That is the journey that we are embarking on, you're embarking on. I get to sit on the sidelines, getting grayer and older by the day, that you're embarking on toward 2026. And I have one piece of advice, and that is be respectful. Keep your personal acrimonies, your personal likes and dislikes off the table. And right now, everything should be on the table, whether it's shortage sharing, whether it's conservation and propping the reservoirs up, increased conservation, or whether it's some form of augmentation. All of it has to be on the table right now. Because if you try to expel something from the table before you've explored all the options, and right now you still have time to do it, you will regret it at the end because it will crop right back up again. People's issues are real. This basin has done a phenomenal job over the course of the last decades in being able to address some of the most difficult sets of circumstances. The talent, the heart, the willingness, the patience are here. All you have to do is roll up your sleeves and begin to listen. It's not whether you can passionately and aggressively state your position. It's about, can you recognize those pressure points that your neighbor has, that that other parts of this basin experience, including Mexico, and the tribes, and the environment. All of them will have to be wrapped up and be a part of the solution of 2026. But if there is a group that can make that happen, that group is the one here in the Colorado River Basin. So learn from the lessons of 2007. Hopefully someone will have a humorous PowerPoint with which to break the tensions. Don't lose your sense of humor, but you will get there. It will be a wild and woolly ride, but at the end of the day, you'll find an extension of 2007 that you can proudly sign in 2026. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions. Yes. Hi, Jenna.
If you could throw a grenade today, what would it be?
What grenade would I throw today? Well, Jennifer, I think you know what that grenade is. I'm not sure you can get across the finish line without some form of augmentation. I really don't believe it. I think, and it's not about steady growth in the basin, it's about the volatility of the water supply. And given the size of the economy of this basin, the richness of its agricultural product, the reliance on that agricultural product across the country and around the world, I think you're going to have to make augmentation a part of that solution. And the technology is there, the science is there, and how to weave that into a conversation which will, by definition, be an extension of DCP on a grander scale, I think is something you're going to have to do. If you don't find a pressure release valve, you're not going to get across the finish line. Yes, sir.
Could you provide us a definition of, could you provide your definition of what constitutes augmentation?
You can desalt. We have vast oceans that would allow us to desalt. I think you can take some larger users and augment their use with desalted ocean water. So I think that's probably the most logical one. Yes.
Hi. Augmentation is nice, but to be devil's advocate, doesn't that just lead you in a circle back to more growth, full use of the augmentation, and you're back in the same spot you were when you began? I mean, how do you limit
Are you going to
augmentation?
stop growth?
No, but how do you limit augmentation to only address the drought situation? Or do
Well,
you?
you can't. I mean, what you'll do is you'll make the desalted water, think about the finances. You'll make it your base supply, which will give you a lot more flexibility for environmental things from the natural river flow. So, I mean, but unless you've got a new magic bullet on how you intend to stop growth, look, this planet's going to have 9 billion people on it. So unless you think that we can build a wall around the 7 western states and avoid that happening, states like California are growing organically. Their births exceed their deaths. We old farts live much longer. That's your problem. I'm not ready to be euthanized quite yet.
Hello. What do you foresee Mexico's role to be in the renegotiations?
Pardon?
What do you foresee Mexico's role to be in the renegotiations?
Equal partner. I think we need Mexico as much as Mexico needs us. I think minute 319 was an enormous breakthrough in allowing us to have a very different conversation with Mexico. And fortunately, we're able to have those conversations no matter who occupies the White House. So, yes, they're a full. I don't think there are any not full partners, even the tribes. You know, they're embedded within each state, but they are active users and they have a clear and precise voice at the table.
Morning, Pat.
Bubble.
Ted Kowalski here. Can you talk a little bit about the fact that IID was not a party to the DCP and
I was
how
trying to be nice.
how we bring them back into the fold? Because as you know, they're the largest water user and I think going to be an important player in the next negotiations, to be sure.
I think the pathway for IID to still join the party is there. I think California has left that pathway open for the Imperial Valley to get there. It's a cultural paradigm in the Imperial Valley. And quite honestly, all of us collectively haven't helped that conversation any. We keep putting them in the bullseye. And if you keep putting someone in the bullseye, their defenses go up pretty quickly. I was greatly disappointed to see that once again, this was deja vu, They tried to load the Christmas tree with so many ornaments that it couldn't withstand the weight, and it cratered on its own merits. I think the one issue IID has that is legitimate is they're tethered, as we are all tethered because of that, to the Salton Sea. It is very difficult for them to cut back on their water use when their runoff is the vast majority of the inflow into this lake. So I understand their issues. I do. And I think all we can continue to do is leave that door cracked and afford them the opportunity to walk through. And Ted, quite honestly, I think that day will come. They will walk through that door. It's just never shut it. They'll walk through it. Yes, sir.
Let's hold up for the mic just for the video and live stream purposes.
Thanks. Which lobbyist groups do you concern you the most concerning water policy over the next 10, 20 years?
Ideologues. Ones that have, it goes right back to what I really based this whole talk on, which was the need to understand all perspectives. There are some ardent voices in many corners that have no regard for others' realities. And I think those are extremely problematic, and I think those don't go very far in helping move toward resolution, because no one is going to be a winner in 2026 unless everybody's a winner. Yes, sir.
Pat, what was the inside story of the California yield breaching their priority with Arizona on the DCP?
I'm not sure I understand that question. I think Metropolitan has recognized for some time that, you know, it's a great thing to hold out there that no shortage, we don't have to take shortage. But let's be blunt. If the worst happens and Meade crashes and nothing leaves Hoover Dam, you can have all the water rights you want. I don't care, paper them, hang them on a wall. It's not going to do you a damn bit of good. So I think Metropolitan's early recognition to be part of the solution was quintessential.
Pat, do you have a prescription for a process that you think we should use in terms of negotiating post-2026? Who should be the convener? Who gets to be in the room? The states, the NGOs, the tribes? And we have all these different interests. How do we structure a process that will get us to a good place that you're talking about?
Well, at the end of the day, it's going to have to be the principals that agree, but you can borrow from some of the structures we used in the Mexico negotiations, or you can borrow from some of the conversations around 2007. You can have an environmental conversation. You can have a tribal conversation. You're not going to displace the principals. They're the signatories to the compact. They're the ones that politically have to make it happen. They're the ones that are going to have to be held accountable for any and all consequences. But I think those other voices, there are side processes and intersecting processes that can be put in place. I mean, essentially what the 7 states are doing with Mexico is an integrated resource plan. That's what you're doing. You're coming up with an integrated resource plan that will work for everybody and will carry the basin through the worst of times. Thank you.
Fantastic, Pat. We're gonna have to get that mic back from you unless you want to continue to talk to us. Which you might want to. You'll have this rebuttal power for the rest of the conference. Okay. Yeah, if you're still looking for seats, you know, other people can sit in this front row with me. I'm not that much of a problem, and there's several other spots. All right. Our next speaker is Terry Folt, who I'm glad to see arrived fashionably late. Hi, Terry. You don't want to be the first person from Reclamation to show up. You want to come in, you know, for your status and all. Terry's a regional director of Reclamation's Lower Colorado River office. And, you know, he's another one of these guys you all know. I don't need to introduce Terry. As Terry reminded me last night, I've known Terry since before I started working here. And I've been here 23 years. So, and at the risk of embarrassing Terry, actually, I hope I do embarrass Terry. At the risk of embarrassing Terry, he's the most impressive public servant I've ever known. And I believe that sincerely, and I see that Interior recognize that with a Meritorious Service Award, and you know, it's, you know, Terry's thoughts I take and opinions I take very, very serious on things. And so, you know, and I think Terry's the only Fed on the program, unless I'm forgetting someone. So Terry has an extra role here today of not only explaining what he thinks is going on and his vision going forward, but he gets to explain everything the administration has done recently. So that'll be fun as well. So that's probably more introduction than you wanted, Terry. Sure. Do you have a PowerPoint?
I do not.
Okay, good.
Well, thank you, Doug, for everything and expectation. It's a pleasure to be here. It's so fun to see so many great, good friends. We all have spent a lot of time on this basin. I'm amazed as well when Doug and I sat last night and thought about how long we'd known each other, and come August, I will have been on this basin 30 years. I don't know where 30 years goes. I think all of us who are a bit age-challenged have that view of life, don't we? But in any event, it's wonderful to be here. I want to start out by introducing my staff that's here. As we all get older and we think about legacies, I have come to the conclusion the key legacy you leave are the people, of course, the people who will carry the ball forward. Many people did that for me and my generation, and so I'm going to do that if you don't mind. In no particular order, Dan Bunk, I think, is here. Is he? No. See, Doug, other people come later than me. I'll tease Dan about it. Carly Jurla, I think, is here. Alan Butler, great. Rebecca Smith, very good. Jesse Kayla, did I even come close? Kaya, there's no L, is there? Thank you, Jesse. Sarah Baker, all in the back there, and Mike Bernardo. Did I miss any of my staff? So I'm going to ask you all to stand, please, so people can see who you are. So this is the brain trust that we leave as our legacy, as many of us head out the door here in, I don't have a date, everyone's going to ask me. My official answer is 1 to 2 years. So there used to be 3 to 5, remember that? So there we go. But I really do want to say that. That is really what's important, are these people that each and every one of you are doing the same. Doug did ask me in earnest to talk a little bit more about the DCP. Some of the challenges ahead and what our federal role in the process will be, and I think Pat defined it pretty well that we heard feral cats, I believe was her term. We do a lot more than that. I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. But I can't start without mentioning the hydrology. I didn't have a PowerPoint, though, so I've evolved over time as well. But if many of you are following the basin, I think closely, the June forecast went up over 1 million acre-feet from what it was in mid-May. If you just look at these two lakes, Lakes Powell and Lake Mead, they're both hanging around 41 to 43%. I think Powell will be 43%. And of course, it's going to grow when the inflow really all starts really coming off. I think that's an indication of the success of the interim guidelines. A big part of the guidelines was to better balance the water in these two reservoirs. I used to and still say it was better to balance and share in the gain of high flow years between the two basins, upper and lower, and in the pain of low flow years. And I think we've done that successfully. We had to do more, and that's the DCP. And I'll want to talk just a little bit more about that. So as Pat mentioned, it's great news. But you all have heard me with this mantra, and you say it as well. One good year doesn't break a drought on the Colorado River Basin. And I think we can extend that mantra and say it, and one good year certainly doesn't solve any of the issues that are facing us as we start to think about what we're going to do post-2026. So the DCP, someone asked me this morning, how many days was it again? You knew I was going to say it, 2,152 days. From the day then Secretary Jewell first met in Park City, Utah with some of us and the 7 governors representatives of the basin states. And she made it very clear our risk is too high. Our risk of these two big reservoirs getting to critically low elevations and being on the precipice of failure, we can't handle it this high. We need to reduce it. We thought we knew the risk. We assessed it to the best of our ability back in 07, the 05, 06, 07 timeframe leading into the guidelines. We knew tree rings had larger droughts. We didn't really think that that was that likely. Obviously, we certainly didn't see this drought. And so it was very clear when she said, you do it or I will. Many secretaries have used that phrase. And a mere 2,152 days later, we met with a very large group of folks on the top of Hoover Dam's Visitor Center, including our 7 governors' representatives, and signed in the DCP agreements. It was complex. Should it have taken that long? Well, things do. Looking back on it, we all tend to, I think, as human beings, we forget a lot of the painful times. Otherwise, we get in the doldrums too bad, right? And we remember the good times. So if you came up and asked me, why did it take so long? My answer is, I don't know. It just did. It was hard. It was complex. That's why, and as Pat said, we all have to win. We have to find solutions where everyone gains. Everyone also typically loses something in those collaborative solutions. But that's what collaborative work means, and that's where we are today. A gentleman here asked a question about California's role in the DCP, and I think my simple answer is this. When we came up with this idea of banking in the 2005 timeframe, let's have banking in Lake Mead. Many of you know in many river basins this is very common, but not in the Colorado River Basin, and certainly not at Lake Mead. The idea was we would limit it. We would limit it so that when we went into shortage, that you couldn't draw water back out of your bank. We actually did our usual thing. We didn't actually forbid it. We just didn't authorize it. That's another good way we handle these complex things, right? We don't have to absolutely say no. We just don't say yes. Well, and that's exactly what turned out. When the deal started to be made of the overall contributions, I'm going to use that term. We could talk about reductions, but I'll call them contributions in Lake Mead. That's the key thing that broke it open. By expanding the toolbox, with banking so that you could, in fact, draw banked water out below elevation 1075. California became very interested. And to me, that was the breakthrough of the high-level DCP deal. I don't want to, though, ignore all the hard work that had to be put in to put that high-level deal in place. And we have a great Arizona contingent sitting right here, and I commend you. It was hard work, and it took time, and that's how these things are. They're hard work, and they take time. So the other big key piece I want to make sure you understand is the participation of Mexico. Pat outlined many of those great incremental steps we've made over time, including minutes 319 and 323 with Mexico. And what Mexico proactively did, most of you know this, but I will state it very clearly, they proactively put in minute 323 their version of the drought contingency plan called a binational water scarcity contingency plan. And what would trigger their share in the contributions would be the landing of the Lower Basin Drought Contingency Plan. And that was a big deal. And I want to single out a representative we have here from Conagua, and Ome Ballin, I believe I got your last name right, did I? Great. We're so glad to have you here. Just as we go through administration transitions, so does Mexico every 6 years. And so it is very clearly how critically important that our transitions don't knock us off our paths. And that's been my 30-year experience on this river system, that as administrations transition, we stay the course, and we've done it again. And we appreciate, again, that proactive effort that Mexico put in to minute 323, and we're right now in the middle of triggering that, and that's will be one of our big focuses. I'll talk just a minute about that, in just a minute about it. It was also mentioned before about, what about IAD? Let me just say it this way. I was personally, from a personal standpoint, I mean this, very disappointed and maybe even devastated when I saw the IAD's board decision in December of 18 last year that said they passed the DCP agreements but immediately suspended them. And as Pat mentioned, asked for something that really was not part of the deal, if I could be that blunt about it. She also mentioned, and I agree 100%, we've left the door open for the single largest water user in the Colorado River Basin to join the DCP. We encourage them to. We would work diligently at the right time from the federal perspective to make that happen. But really what it sits there, it's within California. It's primarily between Metropolitan Water District and the Imperial Irrigation District to try to work a deal. We hope very much they do. Moving forward, post-2026, I'm going to say it in this manner. We on the basin must have IID as a player with us. And I'm going to also say the flip side. IID must be a player on this system as the single largest water user with some of the most senior water rights. They can make great strides with us. So I'm hopeful, and don't take my statement of disappointment to be anything which is other than optimism moving forward. We have to make that work for them, and they have to make it work for themselves. So DCP was a success, but we all called it an overlay to the guidelines. I've often called it a Band-Aid on the guidelines. We can say many things and describe it in many ways, but it was temporary. It hopefully gets us through 2026 as we go through this tough negotiation of what we're going to do in the future without a crisis. That's its point, reduce risk, avoid a crisis. And I believe we've done at least a reasonably good job with the drought contingency plan. So what's next? Section 7.1 of the Record of Decision of the 07 Guidelines states, beginning no later than December 31st, 2020, the Secretary shall initiate a formal review for purposes of evaluating the effectiveness of these guidelines. What we federally believe we should do is spend the better part, the rest of this year, 2019, ensuring a successful start to the DCP and the integration of that to the guidelines. Most of you know in August we will project the January 1st elevations. We will have both the Mexican water scarcity plan and the DCP contributions in those projections. And again, I appreciate Ome being here, and we're working diligently with both sections of the International Boundary Water Commission as well as Conagua to do the work to trigger that plan. So that's key number one. So what about then next year? When do we kick off this formal review, which really is code for start the discussions of what we're going to do next, right? And I think our view right now is we don't know. We'll do it certainly no later than December 31st, 2020. But there's a lot of conversations that need to happen. There's a lot of conversations that have already started throughout the space, and many of you are leading those conversations, and they're all very important. They're very important to start thinking about what Pat said just a minute ago or a few minutes ago, that we all have to know what's in and what's out. And we need to start with a very broad view of what's in and start those conversations to figure out what stays in so that we can get that collaborative solution, so that everyone gets enough of a win to make the deal happen. That's going to take time. That one item is going to take a lot of time as to what we're going to keep in and what we're not going to exclude. I think also it's asked, and I'll use the term, I think maybe Eric and John, I'll ascribe it to you, the grand bargain idea. I'm a subscriber to the incremental approach. I'm not saying we shouldn't talk about the grand bargain idea. I'm not excluding that. I'm not saying we shouldn't throw everything in the hopper again and try to figure out what stays and what doesn't. But we've proven success with the incremental approach. Pat outlined it. I won't go back through it. This is how it has worked. It's kept us out of court, it's found good solutions, and it's kept us all at the table. And that's what we have to make sure we do. If we retreat and go back to our corners and get our bevy of attorneys out and put them out front, we're guaranteed one outcome, and that outcome is paralysis for years. It will be very difficult to move forward in a productive manner if that's the choice we take. It's going to be difficult, again, as I said. The shape of the table, as we often call it, is difficult to ascertain. Everyone has to be involved, but yet, let's face it, when you really get down to brass tacks, it's got to be a small group. And it's a small group in many different settings, so I don't want anyone in the room to take away that, I'm not being in the small group. You'll be in many small groups. But this is how it has to work. One of our key partners on this basin, and I'm not going to ascribe it to a name, has a mantra that we use, and it's everybody likes the idea of a small group until they figure out they're not on it. It's true, isn't it? But there'll be multiple small groups to be able to figure out what groups need to be able to find those collaborative solutions. That's how it'll work. We certainly can't define what it looks like today, but we will define it, and we'll define it a lot in real time. That's how these things really go down. So the last thing to conclude, I want to say, Doug asked me, what's the role of the federal government? Well, I'd say over the last 20 years, through these times of success, Pat had a very good example with Secretary Babbitt. He was absolutely the right person at the right time, in my opinion, as well. And our secretaries tend to be that. We've been a facilitator, we've been a mediator, we've been the water master in Lower Basin, and we've herded lots of cats. And we'll do all those things and more this go around. I think perhaps, though, most importantly, we're what I call the broker of honest information. All of our decisions need to be based on fact. Fact on the things that we know, facts about the things we don't know. And up front, accept that and make sure we all understand that. And that, I believe, is what we can continue to do. It's what, in my opinion, we have done, and I assure you that's what we will always do as your federal government, to make sure that we are basing our negotiations on our best available science and information. The last thing I'll conclude here is that the table has already been broadened, and I really want to commend in the Arizona implementation of the DCP the role of the Gila River Indian community, the Colorado River Indian tribes. Margaret's sitting right here. The tribes have such a key role in all of this, and we've shown very clearly that those kinds of participations in the actual deal, that's the way to go, in my opinion. And so we're anxious to continue those and broaden those relationships. And this will be with each and all the groups that you represented. The tribes, the NGOs, those who came forward with conservation before shortage should be proud of themselves, because that is the basis of what we ended up implementing. And of course, our key partners, the 7 basin states, will always have that special relationship with you all as well. We're anxious to get started, but again, we're going to make sure DCP hits the ground running properly this year and let you all continue conversations, and we'll kick something off sometime in 2020. With that, thank you for your attention, and we're glad to take any questions.
Hi, Terry. You call DCP a Band-Aid, and by implication, it's not the cure. What do you mean? Why is it not the cure?
Well, for one thing, it ends in 2026. But also, I think very clearly, it doesn't resolve these tough issues. This imbalance at Meade, and I will finally start calling it a structural deficit someday. I'm sure I'll be able to do that. But this imbalance at Meade, we have to solve it. And so DCP doesn't solve that, in my opinion. It hopefully, again, keeps us out of a crisis. We certainly have reduced our risk of getting to a crisis in the next 7-8 years, but it isn't the solution we need. So I've called it a Band-Aid, or some have called it a tourniquet. I didn't think we're absolutely bleeding that bad, since we haven't entered shortage yet. And why? Because we're conserving before shortage. You probably all know our estimate is Lake Mead is well over 20 feet higher today because of the voluntary conservation that we've now put in place contractually through the drought contingency plan.
Hey, Terry, thanks for that. Kevin Wheeler from University of Oxford. You talked about the improved balancing of the reservoirs, and it's certainly been a success from an institutional lens, but not necessarily from an engineering or scientific lens. It's not necessarily the most efficient, but it certainly does entrench the notion of upper basin versus lower basin. Do you think we'll need to change some of these institutional divisions to be able to move forward?
Over time, yes. I think we will, because we will evolve and must evolve that direction. I don't know that that means for the next set. I don't know what the next set's going to look like, and we're going to ask each and every one of you to help us define that and help all of us by us. I mean, the collective community define that. So I think it's all about timing, Kevin, but those things must be looked at. I think the microphone is on its way.
Hi. Do you consider the Salton Sea to be IID's problem or the Colorado River Basin's problem?
It's both, if I could say it that way. It is a very difficult problem. We have been working diligently from my office's perspective to help the state in their implementation of the 10-year management plan. That's not enough. That's, again, not a solution to the sea. I don't think we all, probably if we all polled ourselves, we'd have the full range of what's the solution to the sea look like, right? Certainly, the 50s recreational mecca, in my opinion, is probably not where we'll be. I don't think we can be there without large-scale augmentation. I mean, there's a possibility there if we can do something like that. So it's both. It's certainly their problem because they're sitting right next to it, and I think it's the rest of our problem because it's part of the Colorado River Basin. It just is.
Good morning, Terry.
Morning.
I'm going to switch gears a little bit and ask you about the Department of Interior, excuse me, reorganization, and how you see that working into the future with respect to these conversations.
Well, let me just say this. Again, as I mentioned a little earlier, in my 30 years, I've gone through 3 transitions from 8-year administrations to a different party. We've stayed the course through all of them. And this last one's no different. We've stayed the course. Our commissioner, you all know her, I think, pretty well, and she's got great experience on this river basin and loves this river basin. And her leadership, in my opinion, was absolutely critical to finishing the drought contingency plan, or I might have stood up here and said it was 2,305 days or whatever it would have been, right, Doug? But so I believe that's the course we'll stay. Secretary Bernhardt has great experience. He's been in the department before. Many of you know that. He was the solicitor for the department at one time. So he knows it. He's also recused from most Colorado River stuff, at least has been up to date. But I think certainly with Tim Petty, our Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, we have good leadership in the department, and I think we're going to stay the course, and especially over this next couple of years as we start to launch our new negotiation. All right, great. Thank you so much.
For those of you who have attended our events before, you know we have frequent breaks and long breaks, and it's partially because I'm inherently lazy, but it's also because we have really good audiences, and I want you to talk to each other. So this breaks aren't for email, they're for talking to the people who are actually here. And we're going to start one of those breaks now. Again, there's food and stuff next door. I'm actually going to try to, we're 10 minutes ahead of schedule, which never happens. So I'm going to try to bring you back 10 minutes ahead of schedule, which won't be successful, but I'm going to try. And then we'll carry on. All right, thank you.
Yeah.
All right. All right, everyone. Boy, it's tough to get people back in the room.
I still need a mic aim. Do you see her?
No, don't. Well, we'll deal with it when we got to, I guess. If you could take a seat, that would be great. It's so tough. I've already heard references today to cat herding, to feral cat herding, and now to rabid feral cat herding. And this is that category.
Are these seats open?
Yeah, take one in the middle. All right, we're going to get started, whether you like it or not. All right, we are now to session 2 in the program, which is, what is session 2 about? Oh, the DCP's implementation. Presumably how well the DCPs get implemented will be instrumental in shaping how we move forward beyond that. So that is the rationale for doing that at this time. We're going to start this session with Tom Bushatsky, who is currently the director of the Arizona Department of Water Resources. I don't know if Tom will want to hear this or not, but I was actually thinking of Tom about 2 weeks ago when I was watching part of the National Spelling Bee on TV, and these kids, they just could not find words that to stump them, and they crowned 8 co-champions because they kept spelling everything right, and I kept thinking they should ask him Bushatsky. That would work, but they didn't do that. As many of you know, certainly those from Arizona, Tom's been a key player in Arizona water management since '82, working on Colorado River issues, the Groundwater Management Act, and many other things, including DCP. To say the DCP process in Arizona was difficult, I think would be an understatement. Likewise, to say that implementation of DCP also figures to involve a fair amount of headaches as well. And so I've asked Tom to get us up to speed on those things and to think about all it means for the next step after DCP. So Tom?
So thank you for that introduction. I think it took me till about 5th grade before I could spell my own name. So today I do have a PowerPoint, and the title of the talk that I was asked to provide today is What Does the Road Forward Look Like in Arizona? But to understand what our road forward might look like, we really need to understand how the Arizona implementation plan, the plan that allowed us to approve DCP, to build the stakeholder support at the state legislature, There are a lot of lessons to be learned in that process, and that's largely what I'm going to talk about, and then some next steps. But before I get into my PowerPoint, Doug mentioned some anniversaries earlier in his introduction this morning, and I want to focus on the 75th anniversary of D-Day. And probably many of you know that General Eisenhower sent a message to the troops before they deployed for D-Day. And I've taken that message and rewritten it as kind of a rallying cry for what we're about to do in the renegotiation of the guidelines and in the next step. So here it is. We are about to embark upon a great crusade toward which we have striven many months and years. The eyes of many are upon us. The hopes and prayers of Colorado River-loving people everywhere march with us. In company with our colleagues in the Basin States and Mexico, we will bring about a successful plan to sustain the Colorado River and to achieve security for our water supplies and economies. The task will not be an easy one. The challenges we face are many, and special interests will fight savagely to protect their turf. This is the year 2019, and much has happened since the 1922 Compact. The Boulder Canyon Project Act is the law of the land, and the U.S. Supreme Court has upheld its tenets. We have a treaty with Mexico. The Colorado River Basin Project Act is in force, and we have adopted shortage guidelines and DCPs. Collaborative actions on many fronts have given us many tools and placed at our disposal a roadmap for managing the river. I have full confidence in the Basin States and in the courage and devotion of their water managers to achieve nothing less than full victory in sustaining the river. So with that, I will go into my PowerPoint presentation. So I won't spend much time going over this. Most of you, probably all of you, know what the allocations are in the states and between the upper and lower basin. But I did want to point out that Arizona does have an upper basin allocation of 50,000 acre feet, as well as its 2.8 million acre feet lower basin allocation. To give some background on our water use in the state, Colorado River is a very important source. 36% in 2017. The real number is 40%, but we've conserved that other 4% to keep it in Lake Mead to help out with the lake elevations. We have 21% of our supplies coming from our in-state rivers. We still are using 40% groundwater and 3% reclaimed water. So here's a map of Arizona. We have on the left side, along the river, our main stem contract areas, and then the canal, CAP aqueduct, taking off at near Lake Havasu City, going to central and southern Arizona. And about 1.2 million acre feet of our 2.8 million acre feet lower basin allocation is used on the river, close to 1 million acre feet about in Yuma, and then the rest, 1.6 million acre feet or so, average annual delivery through the CAP. And breaking out the total Colorado River water use again the same year, 2017, you can see the various sectors, and I won't go through them one by one, but still substantial on-river agricultural use, 25%, substantial tribal use, 17.5% within CAP, and 12+% on the river, so almost 30% tribal use of our Colorado River water. And of course, municipal industrial sector over 20% as well. So this is a very complicated chart, but it has a lot of important information. It depicts Arizona's Colorado River priority system. When we implement DCP, the reductions in DCP are going to fall through the priority system, unless voluntary agreements, and there have been some, are put in place to move higher priority water to lower priority users. And that was part of our Arizona implementation plan. But on the left, again, we have our main stem priorities. We have priority 5 and 6 unused and surplus. The days that there'll be any water for those folks are probably gone forever. Maybe not. Then we have priority 4, priority 2 and 3, and priority 1, the higher priorities. Priority 4, interestingly enough, is the same priority as Central Arizona Project water. So if you follow the arrow across, you see the priorities then within the CAP delivery service area. Again, it's all priority 4 water. So other excess, that is water that we have been putting under the ground for the Arizona Water Banking Authority or to replenish groundwater that has been pumped out, a function performed by CAP. And then lastly, the federal government has access to that pool for some Indian firming under water settlement obligations. That pool with DCP will be gone next year. There will be no water for that pool. Next, we have the agricultural pool, again, part of the deal in the 2004 Arizona Water Settlement Act. It's currently 300,000 acre feet. Then we have something called NIA Priority. It's the acronym for Non-Indian Agricultural Priority. With the changes in the users, it's no longer agricultural and it's no longer non-Indian. That water is held by a number of cities and tribes, and there's a pot of that still left to do future Indian water rights settlements. And then the so-called original allocations, Indian priority water and M&I priority water in the light blue. And then some priority 3 water that's been transferred off the river to help close Indian water rights settlements in the past. I want to take your attention down to the script at the bottom. Arizona has 86 Section 5 contractors, 86 entities with contracts with the Secretary of the Interior to use Colorado River water, including CAP. So we have many stakeholders. Approximately 20 of those contractors have entitlements greater than 10,000 acre feet. CAP's long-term contractual total, the firm obligations are about 1.415 million acre feet. So you can see we have a lot of stakeholders, and in the past, those stakeholders have relied upon the governor's representative for the state of Arizona, the director of the Department of Water Resources, and a small group of others, some folks from on-river users and CAP, to represent their interests. And one thing DCP has done is make that outcome probably less certain that we will be able to control as small of a group in Arizona as we've had in the past. So again, turning to the DCP contributions, a complicated table. I won't spend a lot of time going through all of it. We've circled Arizona's contributions. As you can see, they start with 192,000 acre feet. When the lake's below elevation 1090, that is a DCP add-on. The next row there, 512,000 acre feet, is the cumulative total of our 320,000 acre foot interim guidelines obligation, and you can track down to the bottom row. But I wanted to point out on the bottom row that in total at the bottom, Arizona would take 720,000 acre feet of reductions. The total of everyone in the lower right-hand corner is 1.475, so we're taking basically half of the reductions. That's a pretty big lift and a pretty big contribution by the state of Arizona. There's lots of reasons, including the whole priority between Nevada, California, and Arizona issue that was talked about earlier. This will be an issue for us, whether we can sustain that kind of long-term reductions moving forward past 2026. So another complicated chart, and there are some things in here that I know are complicated, but I'm relying upon this presentation being posted, hopefully, and know that I wouldn't have time to go through all of this, but I wanted to explain to everybody how the intentionally created surplus program has morphed in Arizona because of the DCP and because of our intra-Arizona implementation agreement. And so now under DCP, we have 600,000 acre feet of accumulation capacity of ICS in Lake Mead for the state of Arizona. Under the guidelines, we had 300,000 acre feet. Arizona was one of the more negative entities regarding even the creation of ICS under the guidelines. But we heard from our stakeholders in our steering committee intra-Arizona process that they valued intentionally created surplus, and they asked us as we went through that process to try to maximize this number for the state of Arizona. And probably even more importantly, we have, through a contractual agreement, split Arizona's intentionally created surplus capacities between non-federal and federal entities, between the non-tribal and tribal entities within the state of Arizona, 50-50, 300,000 acre feet for the tribes, 300,000 acre feet for the non-tribal. To date, only the non-tribal entities, even though some tribes are clearly eligible to use ICS, have participated in the ICS program, pretty much CAP. So this was a major push forward, in my opinion, sharing this tool among the tribal and non-tribal entities. In Arizona, tribes have about half of our Colorado River water in total, and within CAP, about half of the CAP water. So they are absolutely critical partners to the state moving forward, and we're critical partners. I think Terry or somebody mentioned this earlier, Colorado Indian tribes and Gila River Indian community, as we put together the Arizona implementation plan. So a brief description of that plan. It really took years of discussion, including the interstate drought contingency plan process. We really kicked off our intra-Arizona process in June of 2018. Myself and General Manager of CAP, CAWCD, Ted Cook, were the co-chairs of the steering committee, which consisted of, I think, 38 folks. And like we heard earlier, there were probably another 38 folks who were unhappy they weren't appointed to the steering committee. The steering committee was diverse, though. We had water users, stakeholders, legislative leaders, NGOs, tribes. We had a broad representation both on the river and within CAP. And the key to the whole thing, one of the keys was we had legislative leadership, both parties, both houses in the room for these steering committee meetings in real time. And I think that was critical to the eventual passage of the Arizona Implementation Plan and the legislation authorizing me to sign the interstate DCP. So again, a lesson learned for Arizona moving forward as we are negotiating whatever the next deal is, and we are working with our stakeholders in Arizona to remember these lessons, including keeping the legislature in the loop in real time to help make things go more smoothly when you actually get legislation in front of them. We did have 9 steering committee meetings between July and February of 2019, but there were many work group meetings. There were many ad hoc stakeholder group meetings where stakeholders organically came together to discuss their issues, to make proposals, and flow them up the chain, so to speak, through the work groups and into the steering committee. So it was a very broad process and a very intense process that included DWR posting the steering committee meetings online, the videos. We were very transparent. That was also one of the keys. We had an ability for non-members of the steering committee to speak at the end of every meeting, so the public, so to speak, could have their say in the process. And it was a very complicated process and extremely time-consuming for DWR staff and CAP staff, to the point where we were burning our folks out over this several-month period. It was a 24/7 kind of job for all those months, putting together all the preparation, all the materials, and on the backside, getting everything out into the public domain. So again, back to the priority tables within Central Arizona Project. And this illustrates how the drought contingency plan compares to the 2007 guidelines in impacting our water users. So Tier 1, you can see on the left-hand side, without DCP, the agricultural pool water users, and this is Central Arizona Project agriculture, not on-river agriculture, loses somewhere about half of their water in the first Tier 1 level. You can see what happens in Tier 2 and 3. Tier 3 just nicks into the NIA priority users, again, some cities and tribes. Then we overlay the drought contingency plan. Now, something we've coined in Arizona, Tier 0 being that 192,000 acre foot reduction at the top end, cuts out all the excess water, a sliver of ag pool water. But Tier 1 now, instead of just cutting the CAP ag pool in half or so, cuts it out completely. This was a bitter pill for the ag community to swallow. They believe that they had a reasonable expectation, if not more, to have this ag pool water through 2030, again pursuant to the 2004 Arizona Water Settlement Act. And you can see how the tiers flow down. We split Tier 2 now under DCP at elevation 1045 when California kicks in and when additional reductions kick in beyond the 192 for the state of Arizona. And you can see in Tier 3, we're nicking into those highest priority users, the original allocation tribes and municipal industrial users. So the idea of the Arizona Implementation Plan was to basically lessen these impacts, mitigate partially some of these impacts of DCP, which folks were not expecting based on the 2007 guidelines. So the Arizona Implementation Plan has two components. First, a mitigation component. CAP will make wet water deliveries for mitigation or payment for the reductions that those entities are going to suffer under DCP, the incremental reductions. We also have money for new groundwater infrastructure for CAP Ag, which was a controversial piece of the package. So Central Arizona Project Agriculture is subject to the 1980 Groundwater Management Act, but they kept in the 1980 Groundwater Management Act the absolute right to pump groundwater to meet their needs. They were expecting to transition to that groundwater pumping in 2030 when the guidelines were showing, well, when their CAP Ag pool went away. Now they're getting some money from the state and perhaps other sources to build some or to drill some new wells to accelerate their ability to pump groundwater. Still very controversial. There were the 3 no votes in the legislature, which were the only 3 no votes. That was part of their issue. They didn't want to see that groundwater pumping increase and have the state pay for it. But we absolutely needed the agricultural community support at the legislature. For the mitigation, after 2022, there's no more water going to CAP Ag, no Colorado River water. They're going to have to shift to the groundwater. For the municipal tribal entities, starting in 2024, their mitigation goes down to 75%, in 2025, 50%, and then in 2026, 0%. So again, this was a difficult thing for them to take, a reduction in their reasonable expectation of mitigation. But we pushed this out there because of the expectation that we are going to have a drier future, that we're going to have less water, and when we get into whatever the deal is past 2026, you're going to probably have to live with the shortages that are coming, and there's going to be little, if any, mitigation attached to it from my perspective and from the state of Arizona's perspective. So we then had an offset component of the mitigation plan. So here we are taking water out of Lake Mead through the CAP to deliver to tribes, well, mostly ag, but potentially tribes and cities, but mostly ag, when we're trying to keep the elevations of Lake Mead propped up. So many water users said, we're working at cross purposes here. So we created this idea of an offset component to put water back into Lake Mead in essentially the same volume that we expected water to come out of Lake Mead, 400,000 acre feet, through 2 mechanisms, either system conservation or the creation of intentionally created surplus in these amounts of 400,000 acre feet. One very interesting and innovative tool we're using in relation to intentionally created surplus is the state and federal government have obligations to tribes under Indian water settlements to firm their low priority NIA water. Tribes are going to create intentionally created surplus, the Gila River Indian community. They're going to get, that water is going to be committed to stay in the lake through 2026 through dependency of DCP. They will be able to access it later under whatever the rules are for DCP and whatever the new rules will be. But they've made a commitment to keep that in the lake to help create this offset component. And then we have system conservation as well. So some more details about offset component. Again, 400,000 acre feet. So 100,000 acre feet is coming from the Gila River Indian community as part of the U.S.'s obligation for tribal firming. They don't have an obligation to the community, but they do to other tribes. And again, they're losing their access to excess water, which is the way they've been trying to build up their pool of underground storage credits to meet those obligations. The Arizona Water Banking Authority will do 50,000 acre feet towards their obligation for the Gila River Indian community. The Colorado River Indian tribes are going to create 150,000 acre feet of system conservation over the first 3 years, 2020, 21, and 22. And then the Gila River Indian community is going to do an additional 50,000 acre feet of ICS, which it will be able to use again after 2026. And then there's a CAP SRP exchange for 50,000 acre feet. Again, many different diverse groups who had water supplies at their disposal came forward to help put together this plan. Very collaborative process, but at times there were some pretty strident and interesting conversations going on in our steering committee. So I won't go through every one of these agreements, but to effectuate the Intra-Arizona plan, the implementation plan, there are 14 agreements. The ones in green on this list, and there's a second page obviously, are all completed. But I just wanted to illustrate the complexity through the number of agreements that we've had to negotiate. Some of these agreements needed to be done before I signed the interstate DCP, and they were. And some of the agreements are still being finally worked out and mostly approved by boards, councils, et cetera, rather than working out details or certainly working out concepts. So it was another interesting part of the process that the parties who are in these agreements, where the agreements haven't been finalized, still supported my ability to sign the interstate DCP on May 20th, even though each agreement wasn't necessarily signed, sealed, and delivered. So they were taking on faith to some degree that we would successfully complete all of these agreements, even though the DCP itself, as of May 20th, is in effect. So again, schematically, talk about our DCP implementation plan. So cities are providing water to CAP Agriculture in return for underground storage, groundwater pumping credits through our underground storage program that's part of the groundwater code. CAWCD is providing both money and water to CAP Agriculture and money and water to tribal entities, potentially Colorado Indian tribes and Gila River Indian community. And then the state of Arizona appropriated money, again for CAP Agriculture for the well infrastructure, and then for system conservation with Colorado Indian tribes, and also for the water banking and the creation of ICS. We also repurposed existing monies that the state collected. There's a groundwater withdrawal fee for every acre foot of water pumped within the active management areas. For the Pinal active management area, where CAP Agriculture is the largest, we're taking that money and taking it away temporarily from the water bank and temporarily giving it to the Aggies. So we've used a lot of creative methods to come up with the water and the money to make this very complicated plan happen. So again, I wanted to show you this quote from Governor Ducey, and he made this statement when he signed the Arizona legislation on January 31st, 2019, and it says, "As Arizona transitions to a drier future, we must continue to promote a culture of conservation, one that enables the unbeatable quality of life and boundless opportunity we enjoy." So while some of us might have a hard time using the climate change word, this drier future that's what this is about. He recognizes the risks we're at for climate change. He was sending a statement, and he did this in November in a couple of My Turn pieces in the newspaper when DCP was kind of stalling to say, we're facing a drier future, we got to do this, we got to learn to live with less water. He also signed an executive order creating a water augmentation innovation council to look at other issues in terms of Arizona water management moving forward. And again, lesson learned, appointed members of that council through the state, through me, but also legislative folks on that council. Again, learning that lesson from our steering committee process. So my vision of next steps going forward for the reconsultation, the renegotiation, the next deal. Again, we already heard it's supposed to begin by December 31st, 2020. I believe, as Pat Mulroy described, since it's the governor's representatives that need to sign, the states will be leading this process as they did in the 2007 interim guidelines. I definitely recognize the need to have lots of other participation from participants in the state of Arizona. And again, I expect that Arizona's participants in the interstate negotiations will expand beyond what it historically has been. The drought contingency plan, which we began the negotiations July of 2015, was basically Ted Cook and I, the general manager of CAP. It's not going to be two people in the room for Arizona out into the future. Maybe it's a half a dozen or so, but we will work that out. It won't be 86. I guess I can guarantee you at least that much. Again, basin states have yet to discuss among ourselves, at least, the scope of the new guidelines. I agree that we have to at least look at the grand bargain. We talked about that meeting in Park City with Secretary Jewell. I was the assistant director then. Sandy Favorites was the director, but I was with her. The basin state principals gave their staff the direction going forth and putting together a process that we dubbed the outside the box process. No sacred cows, and it was really about the grand bargain, right? We had a list of about 42 maybe items on that list. We tried to work through that for a while and realized we didn't have the time to get there. We split out then into the upper basin DCP and lower basin DCP discussions. But I fully see the need, and I think if we can, the bigger the bargain we create, the better, and the longer the better. But again, lessons learned, and I talked about Arizona's uneasiness with ICS in the mid-2000s, and now trying to maximize ICS within the state of Arizona. Again, we learned lots of lessons. We've already talked about some of them between the guidelines and DCP. And again, we expect reductions in Arizona post-2026 to be unmitigated. People will need to live with less water, and we sent that message expressly through the stepping down of the mitigation in our inter-Arizona DCP plan and in various media opportunities as we were negotiating our plan and as we were negotiating with the legislature the final legislation. So with that, I'm ready for questions.
Much of this was negotiated last year during the worst of the drought. It obviously was tense. We've obviously had good hydrology since then. You've got a lot of water in the lower tributaries. If we have reasonably good hydrology, could you see a circumstance in which you would not have to take Tier 1 shortages through 2026? Could you basically run out the clock? Because you're not taking any shortages this year. Your worst you'll probably do next year is Tier 0. Have you looked to see where it is now, if things are better as opposed to worse? Do you even look at that?
So we have not done a detailed analysis. Maybe there's folks in reclamation who know the numbers in terms of how much we need moving forward. And the place will be above 1090. I don't know if the new 5-year probability table is going to include that. Alan's shaking his head yes. So when we see that, we'll have some probabilities for at least the 5-year time frame. And I know we're all looking forward to seeing that new probability table. But we've tried to send a message in Arizona that expect us to stay below 1090 through the pendency of the DCP. And if we go above 1090, that's serendipity, but don't count on it.
What's your current storage capacity, and what's the future potential for groundwater?
So in total, throughout the state of Arizona, through our underground storage program, our Arizona Water Banking Authority program, we've stored almost 10 million acre feet of water. So through intentionally storing water under the ground. We have lots of room in our aquifers to store more water. I couldn't give you a number, but we have depths to water in a lot of our aquifers, 500, 600, 700 acre, 500, 600, 700 feet below land surface in places. So we have lots of capacity. So if anybody wants to give us their water, not that there's interstate marketing, but we could take it and we could put it under the ground.
Speaking of aquifers, Article 4 and 22 talks about ag and domestic use as the primary uses for compact water, and it talks about hydroelectric. I'm kind of new here. Where does the authority come from to take compact water and put it into the ground? I can certainly understand doing it in the 80s and 90s when the reservoirs were full, but us in the upper basin, we're looking at this and it's pulling mead and pal down, and we're starting to wonder, why do you guys get to do that when we're looking at shortages every time there's a drought and we're sending you water?
So I didn't take Herb Gunther's presentation that was referred to earlier out of the glass case, but one of the things Herb said during the pendency of these guideline negotiations was our underground storage is just as good as your above ground storage in the upper basin. That's what we believe. You have a right to store in your reservoirs. We could build reservoirs in the lower basin. We have to suffer that evaporation. We think we have the right to use that water. We have a state law that specifically defines underground storage as a beneficial use, and it's because of the issue you just raised partially, but that is a drop-dead issue for the state of Arizona.
I said stop right there, not because he threw down the drop dead gauntlet. It's a timing thing. But that was good drama, wasn't it? And that talk set up very nicely our next talk by Margaret Vick, who is the Special Counsel for Water Resources for the Colorado River Indian Tribes. 2 years ago, we had a Colorado River conference here where we talked, among other things, about how the Gila River Indian community was an active participant in the initial stages of shaping DCP, and that's a great story and interesting. It's still an important story. But since then, the Colorado River Indian Tribes has also become involved in the program, as Tom explained. Margaret's been central to those efforts, so I've asked her to talk about the arrangement, how it evolved, what it may mean for the role of CRIT and perhaps other tribes as we move forward in the basin. So, Margaret?
I am, I believe, the first of that bevy of attorneys that deal in the Colorado River Basin. I think we will have more on this panel, and you'll have more throughout the conference. It's an honor to be asked to participate. This is a well-renowned conference on water in the Southwest. I serve as special counsel to the Colorado River Indian Tribes, and that is why I am here today, but I also serve as special counsel for the Havasupai tribe, who have very different water resources. And I think there's a picture of their water in your program. On today's morning session, you'll see some beautiful blue-green water flowing over travertine formations. I believe that's very near the confluence of Havasu Creek and the Colorado River. Is it? Doug's shaking his head. Yes, Sean. And all of this water is spring water. And that is their issue that they are dealing with is springs emitting from deep in the canyons and flowing into the Colorado River. So it was nice to see their inclusion. It was also nice for the conference organizers to provide the topic for today. How did Colorado River Indian tribes, how did their participation evolve in DCP? And I think that we probably could have taken much of Pat Mulroy's presentation and substituted different cultures between the upper basin, lower basin, different cultures between states, a history of adversarial relations, and substituted the words tribes and states. There is a long history of distrust, of conflict between tribes and states. So I'm going to talk a lot about process, but first, let's do a little facts and figures. Let me introduce the Colorado River Indian tribes to you. Their rights were allocated by the Supreme Court in Arizona v. California, 1963 case, 1964 decree. They have the lesser of the diversion of 662,402 acre-feet per year, or sufficient water to satisfy their consumptive use required to irrigate 99,345 acres. That's in Arizona. They also have 58,000 acre-feet of water to be used on the California side of their reservation. Priority dates are their probably primary asset at this time of potential shortage, 1865 to 1874. Their current water use is nowhere near their right. Diversions are high, but return flows are also high. The irrigation system is probably one of the oldest in the United States. It was built and it is currently operated by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It has very poor maintenance, primary reason for the return flows of about 50%. So I'm going to talk in three parts here for my presentation. The first part is related to these facts and figures on the reservation, and also the goals of the Tribal Council over the past decades. The second part is going to be building blocks on what was the process that CRIT became involved in this state-dominated discussions about DCP. And then the third part will be to flesh out a little more of what Tom talked about in CRIT's role in the DCP, and where do we see CRIT's role going forward with primarily Arizona water management for the future. So on reservation water uses, this is Headgate Rock Dam. It's a federal project, not a reclamation project. It's BIA operated, also produces energy. The canal that you see at the bottom part of the picture is the main canal serving the Colorado River Indian Reservation in Arizona. This structure also generates power that's used on the reservation, and you'll see that the overall efficiency of that water diverted from the river is about 50 to 53%. On-reservation water uses are primarily agriculture. Approximately 72 to 73,000 acres of agriculture on the reservation. Of that, 71% is leased land that comes with the right to use water. I'm including in the term leases, assignments, and allotments. There's very few Indian allotments on the Colorado River Indian Reservation. Primary crop for the past 10 years has been alfalfa. For those of you in the Upper Basin, you'll be interested to know that CRIT gets 8 to 9 cuttings a year. They replant every 3 years. They basically grow alfalfa every day of the year on their reservation. The tribe also has a major conservation effort on reservation. They operate the Ahakav Tribal Preserve. It's part of the MSCP program. They have 1,200 acres of restored cottonwood willow habitat right on the river. They have 250 acres of backwater for endangered fish and other species. They operate the plant nursery that supplies the entire lower basin with native plants. And they also have the fish hatchery for the endangered fish on the river. In addition to that, they maintain a mesquite bosque of over 1,000 acres on the southern end of the reservation. It's primarily used for cultural purposes. They use the mesquite wood for many, many activities related primarily to the Mojave culture, but the other tribal cultures on the reservation. And that mesquite bosque is supplied with water with agricultural tailwater. So how did the role of CRIT in DCP evolve? It has evolved over a very, very long time. It is not just the last 6 years of participating in DCP. Tribal leadership has had a vision for a long time. I talked to Bonnie Colby on the break today, and she relayed 1990s, I think it was, when she was working with tribal leadership on this vision of making water available to others off of the reservation, and the tribe receiving the economic return from that. Our search of tribal records goes back to 1972 and a meeting of the 5 lower basin tribes to talk about how they preserve river flows and how they might be able to lease some of their water for an economic return. So CRIT's vision is economic development in the same way that other tribes use their water for economic development, both on reservation, actual use of the water, as well as using water to lease to generate revenues for infrastructure development. For the first time this year, this is an aside off of the slides, the tribes are participating in the Water Smart program from Reclamation. This was a major initiative of CRIT's over the last 3 years. The Water Smart program requires that if you use Water Smart funds for conservation, the water conserved cannot be used to expand irrigation or expand water use of the entity that received the Water Smart funds. There's not a single tribe in the basin who has fully developed their water resources. So to access Water Smart would require them to give up their water rights and their future use of that water. So one of CRIT's initiatives was to get that changed. And that law changed this last year so that tribes may use Water Smart funds, and they will be able to use the conserved water up to their full allocation of water rights. So how did CRIT's role evolve in DCP? Tribal leadership put together a team. It's a different kind of a team than what tribes are used to. So we had our tribal leaders, we have our technical expertise from ag engineers and hydrologists, irrigation experts, economists, and we have political advisors. Most tribes have almost always had lobbyists at the federal level. We hired lobbyists at the state level. And those lobbyists were instrumental in working collaborative with the state, collaboratively with all of the state partners, brought CRIT to the state legislature. We now are partners with our state legislative leaders. We have attorneys, and we also have public relations officials. And bottom line was, it was a lot of hard work over the last 6 years, a lot of time for the elected leaders of the tribe who also have to deal with police, courts, schools, health, and all of the other governmental issues. So our CRIT goals, we knew that the first thing that had to happen was tribal leadership, knowledge and understanding of the basin and the hydrology. BOR made lots of trips to meet with folks on the reservation through the consultation process. We made lots of trips back and forth to Boulder City and to Phoenix. We started a process of regular Saturday tribal council workshops. We invited people to come speak to the tribal council. We held a number of community meetings to bring the tribal community along with the process. They live on the river. They learn to swim in the river. It is a big part of their life. It is a big part of their community. And they needed to understand, everybody on the reservation needed to understand that the river is changing. And there will be big changes moving forward. So we had community meetings. The vice chairman was in charge of doing film projects. And it started with the first film commemorating the 150th anniversary of the establishment of the reservation. And it moved into land and water issues. And they are very interesting. They're all online for download. And then we participated in the tribal water study over a 3-4 year time period. And that developed a great body of knowledge about Crit's water resources as well as other tribes in the basin. All of that is the background to pursuing the 2 primary tribal goals: economic return from its full water right and preserving the life of the river. They are related to and very close with their sister tribe, the Cocopas, and they don't have a river that flows through their reservation anymore. They are the far south reaches of the Colorado River in the Limmatroph section, and Crit wants to be able to help restore water to that section of the river, and they also want to preserve the river as it flows through their reservation. So that opened the opportunity to participate in the Lower Basin Pilot System Conservation Program that accomplished both goals for the tribe. For the first time, they were paid for water. And that water was left in Lake Mead with funding from lots of funding partners: CAWCD, Metropolitan Water, Southern Nevada, Denver Water, and Reclamation. So they tested the concept for 2 or 3 years of, can a reserved water right, a present perfected water right held by the tribe, no congressional action, no settlement legislation, can that water be used in a different place? And yes, it could be. Can we verify how much water? Yes, we could. And it created an understanding of how to do this, building on Terry's incremental steps, 1 step at a time. So this is my understanding of Tom's entire presentation. So you have Lake Mead in the middle. You have water coming out as CAP, ICS coming out for mitigation. That mitigation water goes to the ag pool in the NIA. All right, well, if you have water coming out, there has to be water going in, because we don't want our Arizona process to exacerbate low levels in Lake Mead, so that's the offset water. We have US money going to Gila River and other money going to Gila River Indian community for ICS firming. And then this bottom circle, Arizona funding to Crit for 150,000 acre feet of system conservation. So, sorry, Tom. It doesn't look like it would take 6 months, 2 years, 3 years to get to this. But it gets more complicated. All right, so what were the building blocks for Crit participation? How did this evolve? So I'm going to talk about those building blocks in a series of 6 building blocks in a series of 3 slides here real quick. Awareness led to knowledge on both sides. I'm talking CRIT's knowledge of what's going on in the state and in the basin, as well as basin partners knowing who CRIT is. So we had awareness, knowledge, a recognition of, hey, these guys are real and they have water, and hey, these guys are real, to use Pat Mulroy's phrase, and they have issues. That led to the development of relationships. Those relationships built trust, and that trust led to the development of agreements, which has played out over the last few weeks, and we had our final negotiation session yesterday afternoon. So, awareness, lots of meet and greet, lots of presence at meetings such as this. Tribal leaders attended CAP board meetings on a regular basis. They attended Arizona Water Banking Authority meetings. State water agency leaders came to CRIT, toured the reservation, met with the tribal council. We have also developed a better understanding of what the on-reservation water use is. We now have a water balance analysis of the BIA irrigation project. We've made operational changes. And there has been a spread of knowledge both ways. CRIT has a large present perfected water right in the lower basin, and they have been willing to work with state partners to figure out how that fits in the state-based water management plan. We had to do a lot of work to understand ourselves and help other people understand what the role of CRIT could be within Arizona. We knew Arizona was facing a water crisis pre-DCP, but this is not CAP water. It is not water subject to being cut in the low priority shortage situation. It's the highest priority water right in the lower basin. And we developed the understanding ourselves and with our partners within the state that CRIT water probably is the only remaining new water supply available for water users in Arizona, absent augmentation. That led to the development of relationships, formal and informal meetings. Chairman Patch met with Governor Ducey on a couple of occasions. Staff work with each other regularly, not just state, but CAP staff in the tribe, SRP in the tribe, other major water users, and then through the DCP meetings and more meetings and more meetings and more conversations, large group conversations, individual conversations, small group conversations. We got to know the legislators. We got to know the congressional delegations and their staff, and all levels of government and private entities in Arizona should now be aware that there is this tribe on the river that has a large water right that is willing to participate in discussions. Those relationships helped to build trust between the parties. Historically, there has been very little trust, tribes to states, very little. That is in part for the same reasons that Pat talked about earlier. Those relationships have developed out of litigation. They have developed out of adversarial win-lose relationships. And tribes and states had a historical distrust to overcome. One of the points I wanted to highlight through these negotiations, as Tom said, we had a month of a very, very difficult time in trying to figure out and not knowing if the state DCP was going to come together. And there was somewhat of an expectation that without money, CRIT was going to walk away from the table. Chairman Patch told the group, we're going to leave our proposal on the table. We trust that there will be a solution, that there will be a way to work this out. And that only came from an understanding of the needs of the state, the needs of the water users, and a relationship that had been built with all of the other people around the table. So in the DCP agreement, all of those agreements that Tom didn't show you in detail, CRIT's system conservation agreement is down at the bottom of the list because it didn't get finished till yesterday. So, the funding that came from the state through SB 1227. SB 1227 established a system conservation fund. The state of Arizona appropriated $30 million for that fund. I have been working in Indian country in Arizona as long as Pat Mulroy's been working in Nevada. And it is the first time I am aware of the state legislature appropriating money that goes directly to a tribe. So there was trust that developed on both sides. So we have a system conservation agreement among CRIT, ADWR, CAWCD, and Reclamation. It is modeled after those pilot system conservation program agreements. We use many of the same provisions and we use the same structure. There is a separate funding agreement between ADWR and EDF, the Walton Family Foundation, to provide the balance of the funding for the 150,000 acre feet of water. So it's not just state water user entities, the NGO community is a major contributor and a major participant to make this work. So by the tribe hiring a state lobbyist, that lobbyist was able to work with the legislature to develop this trusting relationship and to protect this funding all the way through to when the state finally approved their budget on Memorial Day. So where are we today? CRIT is making, as Tom put in his presentation, 150,000 acre feet of water available for system conservation. That's 50,000 acre feet a year for 3 years. They will also be creating 20,000 acre feet of ICS that will be kept in CRIT's name in Lake Mead, and they have agreed to a cap on diversions and a cap on acreage and production on the reservation during the term of this agreement. That provides assurances to CAWCD on what their remaining supply is going to be, and it provides a verification check that the water is actually conserved. There were a couple bumps along the way. First of all 9 tribal council members faced a recall, all at the same time, organized by a Water is Life group who were fearful that the tribe was going to be losing their water. All but 1 council member remained in office. The tribe then ran their own referendum called Protect and Prosper, and it passed overwhelmingly by the CRIT voters who authorized the tribal council to proceed on the path that they are on with creating system conservation and seeking federal authority to lease water. The negotiations for the System Conservation Agreement hit a couple of bumps with a misunderstanding on the price per acre foot and the total available funding within the term of the agreement. The trust and relationships that have been built over the last years have really played out over the last few weeks as we finalized those negotiations and put a bow on that agreement about 1:30 yesterday. Delays were caused by the time commitments of all the parties. As Tom said, his staff worked 24/7 for months. Well, you can't sit down and negotiate an agreement with the state when everybody is working 24/7 on very high priority matters. And then one of the biggest bumps along the road was CRIT is going to create ICS as a backstop to their commitments to the state. And there was a California water district that objected to tribal reserved water rights being used to create ICS. And that came very late in the process. And that is one of the reasons why CRIT's ICS, along with all of the other exhibits for ICS, had to be attached to the federal legislation to get that approved. And I credit the attorneys. I was receiving emails through the weekend right before federal legislation, and magically appeared, I think from somebody at Reclamation, a solution that everybody could buy into so that that could move forward. So post DCP, we've talked a little bit about priority, and Tom talked about the role priority played in the DCP discussions, primarily with the CAP priorities. One participant in our DCP Arizona conversations was very fond of saying, we have a drought plan. We have a drought plan in the Western US. We have always had a drought plan in the US, in the Western US. It's called priority. But that is not always what happens and likely not what should happen. It is an important determining factor, but it is not the final arbiter of who gets water and who doesn't get water. So CRIT's goal is to preserve their priority. They think their priority creates a very valuable drought supply that could be used by other lower priority users within Arizona and possibly even in California. But there is federal legislation that's required for CRIT to lease water. The Indian Non-Intercourse Act has to be overcome, and there has to be a specific authorization to the Secretary to approve leases. Part of that legislation will also be an intergovernmental agreement with Arizona to consult and confer, and a recognition of the state's role in water management, including tribal water. So how did CRIT get here? The Tribal Council, how did CRIT's role and participation evolve? The Tribal Council on Tuesday told me to say it started about 154 years ago with the establishment of their reservation. But all tribal leaders, not just CRIT, but all tribal leaders are very much aware of the history of tribal relations or tribal resources in relation to dominant cultures and dominant political groups. There is a history of taking land, of taking minerals, of taking oil and gas, of drawing new reservation boundary lines, and using other resources that used to be tribal and are no longer tribal. And the CRIT Tribal Council set out on a concerted effort to not let that history repeat itself with water. So, next steps, and you're going to have some talk tomorrow, Bitta Becker is going to talk to you about the enduring role of tribes in the basin. So I won't go into many next steps. But not just Arizona, all states need to look at the role of tribes and tribal water as you move towards the future. The federal reclamation has a role in managing the basin, as Terry said, but they also have a trust responsibility to tribes as the representative of the U.S. government in these talks. And Arizona may have the most tribes in tribal water use as far as percentage, but they're not unique. And each state needs to look at their processes for inclusion. So, thank you.
We are running fairly late, but one quick question.
Yeah. I always talk too long, I'm sorry.
What should the role of the tribes be in the negotiations that are coming for post-2026? How should we structure this so the tribes have a proper seat at the table?
Well, I think you look at Arizona as an example, and what both the state and reclamation did. So there were 3 tribes at the table, Gila River with their CAP water that was likely to be, well, it is going to be shorted under DCP. So they had water at risk. You have Crit that had water on offer for the DCP, and you had the Tohono O'odham Nation, who has water that their full rights have not been settled yet. And then from those meetings, you had Phoenix Area Reclamation, Leslie Myers, holding alternate week meetings with all of the other tribes so that if there were issues that were coming up, everyone was aware of what those issues are and could participate in the meetings, because as Tom said, they were a very public process. So it's, I tried to put those building blocks in for just that very reason. It's state officials being aware of what the tribes are, where they are, what their water rights are, tribes being aware of the state process so that you know where you fit as a puzzle piece. And it's a lot of education, it's a lot of work, but I think Arizona is a very successful example of how to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Got to keep our foot on the accelerator here. Next up is Chris Harris, whom all the Colorado residents know is a star cornerback for the Denver Broncos. And I was reminded of this because we did not have a picture for his bio, so I figured I'll just get one online. And well, see, Sean, I told him we should do that, and I got vetoed on that. Our Chris Harris is the executive director of the Colorado River Board of California. And I wrote the little blurbs describing each talk, and I used the word undermines, I think, to describe how the deal might influence California's progress regarding the Salton Sea. And I think you're going to tell me that that was a bad word choice. And I'm looking forward to hearing that.
Great. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here and share a few minutes of your day. And yeah, I'm actually kind of excited to get up here and talk about where California is post-DCP, pre-renegotiation of the guidelines, our Salton Sea issue, and kind of next steps, where we go. And keeping with the theme here of anniversaries, it's the 150th anniversary of John Wesley Powell's trip down the Colorado River. And in 1893, he said, "I tell you, gentlemen, you are piling up a heritage of conflict and litigation over water rights, for there is not enough water to supply the land." And all of us in the Colorado River Basin, all the years that we've been working together, we know that's a true statement. And in fact, what John Wesley Powell suggests is that is a potential outcome if we don't deal with our issues. In other words, we could have litigation and conflict, and sometimes we do and have. But I think we also have learned, and I think Pat really eloquently said this morning, that there is another path. And so far, over the past couple of decades, we've chosen that path and we've worked together collaboratively. And I think, you know, that's been a lesson that we necessarily must move forward with. And I think even here, outside of the Colorado River Basin, California has some experience in that realm as well. Whether you're talking about California's development of its Colorado River water resources, or the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project in the huge Central Valley of California, or the Eastern Sierras water supplies, all of those at one time or another have been fraught with incredible conflict and litigation within the state of California. And we've learned a lot of lessons with respect to each and every one of those development processes. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you've got 35 million plus citizens in the state of California that are dependent upon this collection, this portfolio of water resources, and the certainty and the reliability that they can provide all of us within California. And towards that end, I just want to, both Pat and Terry mentioned it this morning, you know, we do have this 2 decades now worth of collaborating together. And I'm not going to go through each one of these, but just take a look at this list of things we've done since the late 1990s, when Secretary Babbitt was just leaving office in early 2000. Look at the accomplishments that all of us have dealt with at one time or another. And it's pretty darn impressive when you kind of step back and look at it as a package. And I think it does show that there is an alternative path to what John Wesley Powell suggested could result from our ability to manage the scarce water resources in the basin. Another thing that I think is important to recognize, while we've done the DCP, pat ourselves on the back, that's great, but you know, really looking at the 07 guidelines, they actually kind of worked pretty well. I mean, even in the face of some pretty bad hydrology, the bottom line is we were able to keep the reservoir above 1075, Lake Mead. And that's a good thing. So looking at that conjunctive management between Powell and Mead showed that the guidelines did work. And the NGOs, bless their heart, that conservation before storage really turned out to be important. That 2 million acre feet buffered Lake Mead enough where we did not fall below 1075. And without it, we might have been flirting with 1050. So this was important, and I think it taught us a lot and gave us some additional tools in our toolbox, again, collaboratively. It's painful, it costs money, but it did keep us out of having to impose draconian cuts on users within the lower basin. I think the other thing I'd really like to do is I know nobody in this room would ever say that, you know, California isn't doing enough and, you know, there's more they should be doing. None of you would ever say that. But I did kind of want to just remind folks that, you know, even pre-DCP, and we've been doing a lot in California for a long time now, and it's kind of worth just, you know, running through some of the things that we have done. If you look at the agricultural sector since 2003, the Quantification Settlement Agreement, the Imperial Irrigation District alone has conserved 5.3 million acre feet, and that's been transferred within California. Some of that water's been conserved, but the bottom line is there is a lot of conservation occurring over in the Imperial Valley to this day. Palo Verde Irrigation District and Metropolitan have a land fallowing agreement. A ton of water has been conserved there and has moved to the Metropolitan Water District system. Just in 2018, they conserved nearly 100,000 acre feet. So, and there's the agreement in place that they can conserve up to 1/3 of the potential water used within PVID. Coachella has been banking water in its local groundwater basin. This is a lot of good work that's been done over time and continues to this day. In the M&I sector, there have been amazing strides. Within metropolitan service area, they've produced almost 3 million acre feet of recycled water supplies, almost 3 million acre feet of conservation, and nearly 1 million acre feet of groundwater supplies have been produced. And the big thing recently here over the past few years is the amount of turf. It's amazing to me to think of this, but 160 million square feet of turf have been removed, permanently removed in the metropolitan service area. And even Met's member agencies have kicked in wholeheartedly. The Carlsbad desalination plant down in the San Diego County Water Authority, that can produce up to 60,000, almost 60,000 acre feet of desalted ocean water. They've got significant recycled initiatives within San Diego's service area. And then DWP, it's pretty remarkable. The city of Los Angeles, the demand right now for water within the city of Los Angeles is the same as in the early 1970s, yet they have about 1 million, 1.5 million more citizens now. And they have significant environmental requirements in the both Mono Basin and Owens Valley. So, in summary, what you have is this coordinated, collaborative, cooperative efforts, both in the M&I sector and the ag sector in California. Big, massive, the nation's largest transfer from the agricultural sector to the M&I sector, the Quantification Settlement Agreement in 2003, and that's ongoing for the foreseeable future. There is a lot going on in California, and it will continue. Our friend the Salton Sea, and I agree with Pat Mulroy's comment this morning. I personally believe that the basin is tethered to the sea. In other words, ultimately, at the end of the day, I think a solution that can work for all of us needs to include a conscious recognition that the Salton Sea is part of the basin. I'm not passing a hat right now asking for contributions from my sister states or the rest of the folks out here. But just recognize that, and it may have been Terry that said it in response to a question, that, you know, you have to understand that IID needs to be a part of this, and IID is clearly joined at the hip with the sea. So to move forward collaboratively and develop a solution that can work for us all, we have got to address the long-term sustainable management of a smaller Salton Sea. Not just smaller, but sustainable, and I think that's key. And there are really two parts to this, and I identify them as two key issues. One is the increasing salinity and shrinking sea. That's, you know, it's a habitat issue. It's a fish issue that maintain the piscivorous birds that occupy that incredibly important part of the Pacific Flyway. And then the other part of it is the quality of life, the health issue related to the PM10, the particulate matter 10 dust from the exposed playa as the sea gets smaller. These are big, big, thorny problems. There aren't answers to everything yet, but we're all in the state of California grappling with this right now. And I believe it's something that all the rest of the basin needs to be aware of, be supportive of potential solutions, step up when you can, and help us as we push forward to find a long-term path for the Salton Sea. And towards that end, the state of California, I believe, is on the right path now. We have an administration in place with Governor Newsom and our new Secretary of Resources, Wade Crowfoot, who is incredibly engaged in trying to find a long-term path forward. And I am cautiously optimistic, and really continue to, think about this a lot and do as much as I can with our agencies in California to help support this effort. We do have a phase 1 10-year plan that Terry referenced earlier this morning. And part of that, it has milestones of work that needs to be done within this 10 years through 2028. We're a little behind right now, so we've got some catching up that we need to do. We're also a little underfunded. We have about $300 million. We need about $400 million. And I think that a really key part of this 10-year plan is developing a viable long-term plan that can move this forward. So that's something that will need to be worked on and finalized here shortly. Let's kind of turn to what my views are of California's role in the renegotiation of the next set of the interim guidelines. So we have the record of decision that Secretary Kempthorne executed in 2007. And here we are in 2019, and at some point, Terry's going to call us all up and get the principles of the 7 states together. You've got these other processes that are underway right now that are trying to look at setting up some topics, issues, proposals that can be brought to the principals in the United States and hopefully help frame the questions and the process moving forward. But we really don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty in that. So I kind of call it the Rumsfeld principle. And you really do have a set of known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And I like to start with the easy stuff first. And the known knowns, you've got 20 years of operating experience. We kind of know how the guidelines have worked. Now we're going to get another 7 some odd years of how does the DCP actually work? What does that tell us? What kind of good information can it give us? I showed that slide of 20 years of collaborative processes in the Colorado River Basin. So we know that we can solve pretty difficult problems. And I'm not saying that we're going to solve them all in this next set of the guidelines. I kind of agree with Terry. There's probably going to be some dose of incrementalism, maybe blended with a little bit of grand bargain, between our sister states in the upper division. Who knows what that cocktail is going to end up looking like. But I do know that California needs the involvement of all of its Section 5 contractors. I think probably all of you agree. And then I'm going to continue to advocate strongly that the Salton Sea needs to be on the table in this process. It needs to be part of that consideration and that long-term solution. Known unknowns. We've mentioned it, I think, each one of us this morning, and I'm sure many more of you through the course of the next day and a half. We don't fully understand what the impact and severity of climate change is going to be. We don't fully understand the term, schedule, and stakeholder inclusivity and participation of all of these. Obviously, to my colleague Omei, we've got a tremendously beneficial and cooperative, collaborative relationship with Mexico right now. That has worked to our benefit, as you can see with the most recent minutes that the 2 countries have executed, and we need to continue and foster that relationship. Mexico is an equal partner in this development of the next set of guidelines. And I think another kind of known unknown for me, and it could be kind of a big one when you look at what we're going to need to walk through in the context of putting together this process. What are the NEPA, ESA, California Endangered Species Act, California Environmental Quality Act requirements? What is that going to require in the way of, are we going to have to bolster the LCR MSCP to get us through this next 25-year period? I don't know the answers now, but it's certainly something that I think we're going to have to sit down early on and start getting our arms around. Unknown unknowns, your guess is as good as mine. But I think in closing, what I really want to leave all of you with, and I hope you're convinced that in general, California has been a good partner in this. I know we've had our hiccups and hitches in our giddy up here and there, but we are willing to be a good partner. We are willing to continue to collaborate with our sister states, with all of the stakeholder groups in the Colorado River Basin. And I got to tell you, we are a firm and devout believer in incentivizing conservation. That has been the key to California's future. If the state water project is dry, I have got to rely on Colorado River water resources. This year, with the state water project booming to a large degree, I can leave more water in the Colorado River system. So those things inure to the benefit of the basin. But that's the complexity that we have to deal with. What are our Eastern Sierra supplies like? What are our state water project supplies like? And then what does that mean? What are the implications on our Colorado River water supplies? So we love this notion of adaptive flexibility and incentivizing conservation. And we're willing to work very closely with Nevada and Arizona and our sister states in the upper division to advance these types of tools and make it work for all of us. And frankly, to kind of answer Doug's question in the little write-up he gave me, California's ready. We're up for the challenge, and we'll be there with all of you. You have my promise, and I believe the promise of all of the contractors within the state of California. And then I'll finish off with good old Yertle the turtle again. And I know up there on top you are seeing great sights, but down here at the bottom, we too should have rights. So there you are. Thanks very much. Mike Cohen.
So, Chris, one of your known unknowns was inclusivity for the renegotiation of the guidelines. And listening to the tremendous work that Arizona did to have a pretty broad and transparent process with not all the stakeholders, but many of the stakeholders, maybe you can speak to how the California process, which was a much smaller set of stakeholders, but much more opaque or almost completely opaque, and in the end led to a particular hiccup. How the renegotiation, how that table is going to be expanded and what those stakeholders should look like.
Well, to be fair, Mike, I don't fully know the answer right now. I really don't. I think that's something that within California and within the contractors and within the California stakeholder group, whether it's Salton Sea interests, et cetera, I think we still have some work to do over this next year and a half to kind of settle on how that will shake out. I will say, though, that a lot of the participants in California who will not only be participating in the renegotiation process, but also are involved in Salton Sea issues and so forth, are involved in these other processes that are underway right now, whether it's Kathy Jacobs' group. There are several things going on where I think we're getting this idea of process and governance and institutional issues and topics that are either on the table or taboo, getting those things identified. And then the contractors within California are also doing the same thing. We're trying to do our homework and due diligence right now. So stay tuned. I know that's not a great answer, but it's basically the best I can give you right now.
That's how Sean gets his exercise. So I have a question that's a carryover from Margaret Vick's presentation. I was curious which California district objected to CRIT using its reserved rights?
It was the Coachella Valley Water District, and it was
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, well, and it wasn't. I think it was, there's some ongoing litigation related to groundwater issues in the Coachella Valley and some of the San Luis Rey Band of Indian tribes. Agua Caliente, thank you very much. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I would suggest that Coachella, Reclamation, the CRIT, the solicitor's office, they worked very diligently at the very last minute and did come up with a workaround for that, because California, there was no way in God's green earth I wanted to have California be the reason that Tom's plan could not go forward. This is to the benefit of all of us in the basin. We needed to find a way to get over the Rubicon there, and we did. So, and I guess, Michael, to further answer your question, I really do think that Mexico, the NGOs, all of those, there is a role and a place in this next renegotiation of the guidelines. That's very important to me. I think it's important to all of the California contractors. It really is. So we'll see how all of that shakes out. And stay tuned. You'll get your call. You're not going to be by yourself. Thank you very much.
All right. Batting cleanup here is Amy Hawes, who's the Executive Director of the Upper Colorado River Commission. The DC, at least from an outsider looking in, the DCP process looked fairly peaceful, I would say, in the upper basin. I'm sure I missed a few things. But it also looks like a lot of the heavy lifting has been punted till after the agreement in terms of what the demand management program, what might it look like, and what does it mean for us in terms of what is possible in the future. So there's plenty of things there for you to talk about. Amy?
Thank you, Doug. Upper Basin, last but never least. God, we could do a lot with this. Upper Basin, bringing up the rear. And I, too, am going to pile on for a minute in terms of Doug's ever provocative titles for these presentations. Building a real demand management program in the Upper Basin. As opposed to what? Really big, huh? I was thinking, well, an unreal or a fake demand management program. I think I prefer to use the term operational demand management program. And whether that's real or not, I'm sure is open for debate, right? The bad news first, I too have a PowerPoint, but the good news is I've only got 8 slides, so bear with me. And I struggled a bit putting together today's presentation. I thought, what new or novel things can I say about demand management that haven't already been said? There has been a keen interest in demand management, notwithstanding Doug's comments about the relatively calm negotiations in the Upper Basin. There was really laser-focused interest in demand management in the Upper Basin, primarily and understandably in this state. It's hard to know where we're going to land with demand management. I have endeavored here to identify some of the challenges with developing and implementing a program from my perspective, but I want to be clear that I don't represent the perspective of any particular Upper Division state. And then finally, I realize that I've been asked to talk about demand management today, and demand management certainly is a very important tool for us in the Upper Basin with respect to our Upper Basin DCP. But I don't think that's where the bang for our buck is. I really think that where it's at with respect to the Upper Basin DCP is in our drought response operations. When we consider the cap, the volumetric cap we have on demand management volumes in the demand management storage agreement versus the potential slugs of water that we will be releasing out of the initial units to Powell, I think that pales in comparison to what we might be able to achieve in terms of keeping those reservoir levels up at Powell using drought response operations. So let me move in here. So what is it? What is demand management? First and foremost, as I mentioned, it's one of the 3 elements of the Upper Basin DCP in the form of the Demand Management Storage Agreement, and that was fully executed last month along with the other DCP agreements. The other 2 elements, I mentioned drought response operations, and then we've got a weather modification component as well. So as defined in the Demand Management Storage Agreement, demand management is, and I've parsed it out, so bear with me, the temporary reduction in consumptive uses of upper Colorado River system water or the augmentation of supplies using water imported to the upper Colorado River system, if necessary, in order to assure the upper basin non-depletion obligation under the 22 Compact is satisfied. Okay, said another way, demand management is essentially keeping Powell elevations sufficiently high so that the upper basin can comply with the Leaf Ferry flow obligation not to deplete the flows at Leaf Ferry more than 75 million acre feet per any 10 consecutive year period. Okay, it's really tricky to discuss the DCPs when we're having such an amazing year in the Upper Basin, and you know, almost every speaker has acknowledged that. I can't resist this slide, and I've poached this from Reclamation, Terry's folks. As of Tuesday, we were actually at 538% of the average seasonal snow water equivalent in the Upper Basin. So essentially, what does that mean? The snowpack is not melting. It's cold. You know, we're holding that snowpack together, and we're going to, as a consequence, experience a delayed runoff. And if you look at the figure on the left, the vast majority of the subbasins in the Upper Basin are above 150% of normal, and some are way above. I mean, it's like aberrant. For instance, the Dolores-San Miguel Basin in Colorado and Utah is coming in at 1,393% of normal snow water equivalent, so it's pretty big. This is slightly more sobering, this slide. You know, this really rosy hydrology belies the reality of the last 20 years, and you've heard it for the last couple of hours. And as they say about one good year, not only does it not end a drought, it's just one good year. So this slide depicts the unregulated inflow into Lake Powell since the lake filled in 1964, as well as projections for water year 2019 based on the May 24-month study. The horizontal black line represents an average annual inflow of 10.83 million acre feet. However, in here, the water year 19 forecast shows inflows into Powell to be 12.13 million acre feet, so we're above the average, which is all good. However, as you can see, since 2000, the beginning of the drought of record or aridification, depending on who you talk to, inflows into Powell have been less than average 15 of the last 20 years, and inflows have been less than half the average in 4 of those years, which also represent 4 of the lowest 5 years on record. Even with the bumper year we're experiencing, the May 24-month study most probable elevation for Powell at the end of calendar year 2019 is about 52%. Moreover, current predictions are for increasing demand and increasing supply, amplified by persistent drought or aridification and climate change. And as always, I'm looking forward to Brad Udall's presentation this afternoon on climate change. A brief history of demand management in the Upper Basin. In 2014, the UCRC adopted a resolution regarding the development of an emergency Upper Basin DCP. Among other things, the UCRC committed to exploring the feasibility of developing and employing a temporary, voluntary, and compensated demand management program within the Upper Basin to help reduce consumptive uses, if and when needed, to protect against Powell reaching critical elevations, such that compact compliance continues without impairment to existing water uses. From 2015 through 2018, the Upper Division states through the UCRC administered the System Conservation Pilot Program. The SCPP was not intended to get conserved water to Powell. Rather, it was a proof of concept to determine whether there was a market for voluntary, temporary, and compensated reductions in consumptive uses in the Upper Basin. And after 4 years of administration of the SCPP, we determined that yes, there certainly is a market. We also learned a lot along the way, some of which I'll get into further on in the presentation. So almost exactly a year ago, the UCRC adopted another resolution, and this time it was to suspend the Commission's role as the contracting entity for the Upper Basin SCPP after 2018 in order to focus its efforts on some of the outstanding considerations related to the administration of the SCPP, especially given the role of demand management in our Upper Basin DCP. That is a segue into the development of the demand management storage agreement, in particular, the possible development of the demand management program in the Upper Basin. Why do we need one? Well, for one, that's a pretty loaded question in the Upper Basin. There are some folks who don't think we do and would prefer to wait for an involuntary curtailment under the 48 Upper Colorado River Basin Compact if our non-depletion obligation cannot otherwise be satisfied. However, others advocate for taking a proactive, voluntary approach, if possible, in lieu of or prior to the imposition of mandatory shortages in the Upper Basin. So whether we in fact develop a demand management program in the Upper Basin remains to be seen. It is not a fait accompli. However, the demand management storage agreement provides a process or a mechanism for us to do this. So some of the major elements of a demand management storage program would include, or actually of the agreement, include the authorization of storage of conserved water free of charge and in perpetuity in the initial units of the CRISP, which are Flaming Gorge, Aspinall, Navajo, and Lake Powell. This authorization really importantly survives the term of the DCP, so it survives beyond 2026, and that was a big deal for the Upper Basin. And you know, a lesson learned in terms of administering the SCPP, you know, does it make any sense for us to continue to conserve these volumes if we have no place to store them? Secondly, water can only be stored and accessed if a demand management program is developed. That is an absolute precondition. No storage without a program. The demand management storage also establishes a framework for development of any demand management program. I mentioned that earlier. It restricts the release of stored water demand management volumes for compact compliance purposes only. Water stored under a program is not subject to the 07 guidelines or whatever the post-2026 operational criteria may be. Demand management creation is capped at 500,000 acre feet for the term of the DCP. And then the program can only become operational with a UCRC finding that it is necessary for compact compliance. So there's no storage until and unless the UCRC says so. Any program requires agreement with the Secretary of Interior on the verification and accounting of conserved consumptive uses, and any program requires consultation with the lower division states. Also, any water stored under a program is not subject to release until 2057, and it's also not subject to the constraints of the 07 guidelines or whatever the post-2026 operational criteria may be. Finally, and I'm going to make a really fine point here because it's kind of job security for me, and that is, while the UCRC plays a central role in any demand management program, we are not a party to the demand management storage agreement. The four upper division states are, along with the Secretary. So demand management in the Upper Basin DCP generally are state-driven processes. They're not commission-driven. All righty, after all that background, looking forward, and again, this is from my perspective, big disclaimer here, I think there are some key challenges confronting the Upper Basin in standing up a demand management program. There are others, to be sure, but I've zeroed in on 7 that I think are particularly challenging. And again, this is from my perspective. And for those of you who are familiar, intimately familiar with the terms of the Demand Management Storage Agreement, you'll notice that some of these do track that feasibility analysis that's required for any demand management program to be stood up. So first, funding, big question mark. Our modeling suggests that between 200 and 500,000 acre feet are needed to make a difference in Powell elevations, and that roughly translates to between 2 and 5 feet of elevation at Powell. Based on our experience with SEPP over 4 years, our average acre foot conserved consumptive use price hovered around $180. Given that, the cost of project compensation alone, not administration or any of the other overhead that would be required, will range from between $36 and $90 million. A related issue is that we estimate that approximately 47,000 acre feet were conserved during the 4-year life of the pilot. So even with this new federal authorization to store these volumes, something that we, again, identified as essential based on lessons learned from the SCPP, we would need at minimum to conserve more than 4 times that amount. And we have, just about 7 years to do it. So next, there are both intrastate and interstate aspects in any basin-wide demand management program. Each of the 4 upper division states has unique legal and regulatory frameworks that must be adhered to for any one state to sign off. And consequently, the treatment of demand management water may differ from state to state, not surprisingly. For instance, does participation in a program make water rights vulnerable to claims of forfeiture and abandonment under the laws of a particular state? Regarding some of the interstate considerations that rise to the top, one is the shepherding of water, and that's the shepherding of water across state lines and to Lake Powell from the initial units, or maybe the shepherding of water from one initial unit to another without diversion by another water user on the way. How does this look? And do we have existing legal mechanisms to do this, or must they be created? And how will each of the 4 states participate in these shepherding activities? Finally, and this is not on my slide, but I think it's critically important, and that is the preservation of the stakeholder support that we experienced for the SCPP. There was widespread interest and support generated by the SCPP in the Upper Basin, both from participants, but also from the NGO community. And I think it's critical that we shore that up and we cultivate more of that support. I think that's really critical if we're going to stand up this program. Finally, accounting and verification. There's substantial work that must be required to verify, account, and monitor the creation, delivery, and storage and release, for that matter, of the conserved consumptive use volumes. This is part and parcel of our feasibility analysis under the agreement, and verification and accounting is subject to agreement between the upper division states and the secretary and consultation with the lower division states. This was a really hard-fought provision for those of us who lived through the DCP negotiations, was that accounting and verification piece. The lower division states were emphatic that they wanted to be a part, understandably so, of any sort of analyses that we undertake and where we land with respect to accounting and verification. Also, the demand management agreement expires at the end of water year 2026, as do the other DCP agreements. And this gives us precious little time to research the feasibility of a program, develop a program, get the requisite approvals to implement a program, and then finally implement that program. Can we accomplish this really in less than 7 years? It's a big question. That's a bigger question, especially when we consider the limited resources we've got and the major competing demands on our time, most particularly the renegotiation of the guidelines beginning next year, which is sure to command substantial time and energy. Also, how will a program look? Will it focus on traditional water banking or something that can be deployed as necessary when the hydrology indicates? How do we manage risk and determine an appropriate level of conservation given the vicissitudes of hydrology? How do we minimize large investments in conservation that might be rendered unnecessary by a wet year? So perhaps we need to consider non-traditional forms of water banking, similar to some of the tools that the Lower Basin has been using for years, things like option agreements and dry futures banking, so that if the hydrology changes, we don't have a big pool of water sitting down at Powell that's just evaporating. Finally, administration. Who is the best to administer a program if and when one is developed or implemented? And based on the UCRC's administration of the SCPP, I can attest that this is a substantial commitment of time. And whoever administers a demand management program must have the wherewithal to devote much of its organization's time to administering such a program. We were fortunate, at the UCRC to have a reclamation staff engineer detailed to us to help us shoulder that burden. But it certainly deserves a lot of thought and attention in terms of how any program will be administered. Okay, couldn't resist. I think I'm going to leave it here with a photo of the DCP drafting group, or we were officially called the Coordinating Committee, and I was very fortunate to be a part of that. And this is the group that was charged with drafting the key upper and lower basin DCP agreements and bringing those concepts back to the respective principles. So consequently, I, along with these folks, spent the majority of last summer holed up in really dark airport hotel conference rooms, and we were kind of cloistered. And in fact, one of my colleagues in this photo sent out an email recently, and she said, I'll really look forward to not seeing you anytime soon. Yeah, we all kind of get that. And maybe for the first time ever, I am envious of the lower division states, because when I look to my colleagues in the lower basin, I think your DCP is done. You know what happens at Tier 0 and above and below, for that matter. By contrast, in the upper basin, ours is just beginning. I spent little time on the Drought Response Operations Agreement. There's no plan in that agreement. It merely sets forth a process, much like the Demand Management Storage Agreement sets forth the sideboards for the development of any demand management storage program. So we are just beginning, lucky us. So it promises to be a very interesting next 7 years. Thank you.
Don't leave yet. We're going to do a few questions, and I'm now tasked with running around with the microphone. So let's do questions from this part of the room. All right, I got one over here.
Thanks so much, Amy. It sounded like from your presentation that you were thinking of the formation of the DMP as a process that was freestanding, maybe parallel with the 2007 interim guidelines renegotiation. And I guess what I'm wondering is, could they not be integrated, or did I misunderstand the way you were thinking about the relationship between those two processes?
That's a really good question. And we've actually got some language in the agreement itself that references the fact that we don't make any representations that a program, if one were to be developed, would transcend the terms of the DCPs, but we anticipate that there will be discussion about such a program in the renegotiation of the guidelines. So I think that that's an expectation. We'll see how it plays.
All right. Any questions in this general? Oh. All right, hold on, John.
Thanks, Doug. One of the issues that I have not heard about is soil conservation and cover cropping and other means of preservation of soil capacity to store water. How is that going to fit in the DCPs? Thank you.
So I'm going to answer that two ways. The first is, we'll see. I mean, that is part of any feasibility analysis, I think, in terms of developing a program. What'll that look like? We have lessons learned from the SCPP in terms of the types of conservation that could potentially be included in a program. So that's my first, that's the easy answer. The harder answer is, in terms of those lessons learned from the SCPP over the course of 4 years, we really figured out that we needed to pay more attention for the measurement of conserved consumptive use. And I think coincidentally with our administration of the SCPP in 2018, a Utah State paper was released that basically claimed, look, you've got a lot of part season fallowing projects in the Upper Basin. They are not conserving the volumes that you may be representing that they're conserving. Really good information, something that we will certainly look at when we are developing a program and really focused on the feasibility elements of any program.
All right, we can take one more. Have I been neglecting people back here?
There's one in front.
Oh, of course there is. Well, I was going that way. Who has the question? Oh.
I wondered, since Doug asked you to talk about demand management, but you started by saying the drought response operations agreement was potentially much more
consequential.
Payoff. Yeah.
Right.
So maybe just the question is, so in terms of time and concentration and money and all that stuff, how does that get allocated? It sounds like the operations agreement should be much more important, and yet this demand management stuff is obviously plenty complicated on itself. So how do you think states and all the participants ought to allocate their attention?
Right. It's an excellent question. Let me start by saying that the process for any sort of a drought response operation is embedded now in the agreement. And it's all driven or dictated by hydrology, by modeling, looking forward using the 24-month study at what the projected elevations will be at Lake Powell. We've got a target elevation that's included in that drought response operations agreement, and that really dictates the deployment, if you will, of a drought response operations. So there's not necessarily, we're not now working particularly on any sort of a drought response operation, because that is going to be driven and ultimately dictated by hydrology within the parameters of this, agreement that we have created. So I think for me, in terms of resources, I'm far more concerned about how strapped we may all feel in the Upper Basin with the competing demands of developing a demand management storage program. And as Jason said, I will concede that I think that's going to be part of the guideline discussion, but it's certainly not going to be the only thing that we're going to be at the table talking about. And obviously the renegotiation, I think that's going to be the rub.
All right. Wonderful question. Thank you. You are free to go. I guess I'll just walk around with this. I wanted to also thank Amy for working with me to make sure the commission's meetings did not overlap with this event, because it looked like for a while that that they might do that, which would have been very bad. But Amy made sure that didn't happen, so thank you. We're going to break for an hour, or reconvene at 1 o'clock, and I'm going to urge you to actually be back at 1 o'clock, because our session after 1 o'clock is pretty tight on time, and I think it's going to be really interesting. In the meantime, we have, if everything went as planned, we have food upstairs for you. Lunch is just one floor up, go up the big staircase up one floor, and then turn back around. And I don't think our cafeteria area is big enough. It might not be big enough for everyone, but grab food and wander off and go outside and enjoy the day. So thank you.